banning suspected extremists from re-entering the UK for 2 years or more, and tougher monitoring if they're allowed back in.
On the Sunday morning news show, 4 panelists, including Douglas Murray, were seated to debate on whether documented jihadists should be allowed back into Britain. The host introduced the show with the possibility of 200 British jihadists returning. That set the stage nicely for the panelists.
Well, I think what we've seen happening in relation to the threat over recent months, and Andrew, and indeed in the last few years, is that the threat has become more diverse. So there was a time when people were looking at perhaps just Al-Qaeda-related threats, Al-Qaeda-related threats that were long time in the planning. Now the threat is more diverse in terms of the number of groups out there who will be looking to...
But first, let's have a listen to what Theresa May, in her capacity as the former Home Secretary, had to say about the subject. She acknowledged that the problem was complex. Apparently, there were all sorts of scenarios to take into account, from elaborately planned attacks to lone wolf attacks and everything in between.
It's not academic. The last time I was on this program, I think probably the last time Miriam was on this program, we were joined by a young man called Abu Rumeza, well-known extremist around Britain, well-known for his extremist connections. He talked about how wonderful he thought the Islamic State was then. Some of us said, well, in that case, why don't you go and join them? In fact, 2 weeks ago he did, and he took his young family.
And that represented a fitting preamble to the in-studio debate on the issue. Douglas was roped in first, and he immediately referred to the last discussion on this same show. At that time, they had a well-known radical Islamist on the panel. He has since moved his family to Syria in solidarity with ISIS, so it was really a problem of allegiance whether to Britain or a radical cause.
I think the most desirable thing would be that people who have participated in very, very bloodthirsty massacres do not ever return to the UK. Either they're killed in fighting, or for some other reason they don't come back. But if they do come back, we have to work out a policy of what to do with them. Now, some people say, why don't you try them? Why don't you put them on trial? In many of these cases, we won't know exactly what people have done. It's not possible for the Metropolitan Police to go out to the Syrian war zones and speak to people and gather.
To him, the ideal solution involved revoking the citizenship of such radicalized elements because they couldn't help themselves or be helped. Alternatively, they could be tried in court for their crimes, but Scotland Yard didn't have the resources to pursue such cases in the far-flung Middle East.
Rehabilitation for so-called jihadis, but I think it's been often misrepresented because the individuals that they're targeting primarily with the rehabilitation are individuals who went out, may not actually have ended up involved in frontline action, have become disillusioned with what they thought they were going out to do, which was either help Syrians or join some sort of utopian state, and have come back and actually want to reintegrate society.
The co-panelist named Miriam strongly disagreed with his views, and she insisted that beyond letting British jihadists back into the country, there was the option of rehabilitation. A country like Denmark had tried out the idea and succeeded. Usually, radicalized individuals were mostly delusioned youth, and all they needed was to be pointed in the right direction.
I think it's very interesting that we would sort of try and essentialize Islamic State. They're very much like any cult, or if you like, I think you can
look at their origins.
If you compare them to any sort of cult or gang, there are usually some similarities with the broader concept from which they are derived. So you get.
The debate also extended to how the underlying problem was religion. Miriam countered Douglas's argument by stating that extreme breakaway factions were not exclusive to Islam. All world religions suffered the same problem. In Al-Qaeda's case, it may very well have arisen because of a growing hatred of Western nations for their divide and conquer policies.
For instance, I don't know all the facts, but that Ronnie Biggs was allowed back here, you know, the expense of looking after him when he had turned his back on this country. Why didn't we say, sorry mate, it's too bad.
But that aside, all the panelists agreed the problem was real and sorely needed a solution. But sincerely speaking, as one was it possible to rehabilitate anyone who had deliberately turned their back on society? Perhaps such a program would be based on the level of radicalization of the said individuals.
rehabilitation is a great ideal, of course it is, and it, you know, maybe what we should aspire to, but it is very expensive and it isn't always effective, and it takes 30 people. If you decide on surveillance, that takes 30 officers to watch one person.
One of the panelists took an opposing view by suggesting that de-radicalization was in fact a tall order. She also pointed that it was expensive in the range of 30 Metropolitan Police officers to one person. Apparently, any radicalized individual let back into the country had to be constantly put on surveillance, let alone being afforded an education and a job.
But my first principle would be it is a privilege to be here and you have to earn that right.
Well, it's not necessarily a privilege if you've ended up here because your parents were here because of colonialism or an empire. I mean, you're here because of history.
But it's still a privilege.
Well, yes and no.
I think it's a privilege to be British and to live here. I think we should have that principle.
To be sure, her point was you have to earn the right to be a British citizen lightly. But the other panelists disagreed. Legally speaking, being a British citizen is non-negotiable as is, and that right cannot be revoked at will. Miriam also pointed that some people became citizens by virtue of birth and colonization. But should anyone who turns their back on their country of citizenship be made to pay for it?
Whether they're misinformed idealists, they're 17, 18-year-olds. Alan, not everyone who left to involve themselves in the war in Syria were looking to side themselves with the terrorist groups, and that's where it all gets a bit mucky and vague.
As pertaining to the war, not everyone who went over to Syria ended up as hopeless cases. Many were misled. Indeed, it was a very strange war with multiple sides and factions. For instance, those who went over to fight against Assad ended up with ISIS for whatever reason.
Available
but the figures
also for dealing.
The figures from Denmark, though, Anne, are that they said that last year 31 people went out to fight in Syria, and this year it's 1. And they think that it's down to their policy of de-radicalisation.
And one of the questions we keep asking ourselves is, why are these young people being radicalised? And the best way of getting that information is from the people themselves.
But back to the solution of rehabilitation. The host made an interesting observation on how the Danes were succeeding at rehabilitation radicalized Muslims within their borders. They had managed to drastically cut down the number of individuals taking trips to Syria. One more panelist suggested that the only way to understand how young people were radicalized is by getting to know first-hand experiences.
It is also really a privileged position to stand here and say that there are citizens in this country by virtue of their ethnic origin who can have their citizenship withdrawn from them. It is
there is something.
It's nothing to do with ethnic origin.
It is a racialised conception of citizenship.
That was Miriam, reminding the panel that revoking people's citizenship was a bad idea. She mentioned the case of the Vietnamese British citizen who was in court regarding the same issue. Certainly, it presented a bad precedent, and being granted the citizenship of any country was sacrosanct and represented much more than a privilege. Ultimately, it transcended the boundaries of race.
You supposedly sending them back to. Let's take the most recent case of a young man who is who's of Vietnamese origin but who's a British citizen.
This is the one going through the Supreme Court.
Absolutely, he's going through the Supreme Court at the moment. Britain wants to take away his citizenship. Vietnam says he's got nothing to do with us. He's not a Vietnamese citizen.
To further buttress her point, Miriam raised the problem of an individual suddenly becoming a persona non grata. In the case of the Vietnamese man, his home country refused to accept him, on top of the fact that the British government were throwing him under the bus. In any case, the Vietnamese man was either fully British with all the accorded rights, or he was not. There was no gray area where his passport could be taken away.
And their passports or go over to fight for them, believe they are a state. Let's pretend another pseudo-state was set up from any other religious or other kind of background. If people from Britain were going to that state of any background or any origin, and they were cutting off people's heads and raping women and children and so on, I think this country would take a rather tough stance about it. And I think, among other things, one of the things we would look at was withdrawal of passports, among other things.
As usual, Douglas disagreed by saying certain behaviors warrant that sort of treatment. If anyone was so reckless as to fritter their freedoms and rights, then they deserve what was coming to them. But then again, that view represented an extreme example, which hardly ever came to play. And if ever it did, you could blame it on polarized racism, religion, or revolutions. So, we would like to know your thoughts on this. Is it legal or even possible for an individual's citizenship to be taken away? Tell us about what you think in the comments section.